Good afternoon, church family. Nice to see everybody today. I wanted to speak on the topic of failure a little bit briefly today, and specifically the phrase that's come to my mind, and the phrase I'd like to encourage you with if you have failed, as I have many times, is all is not lost. All's not lost. And I was reminded recently, I was taking a walk with my kids, and one of my little ones looked up. It seemed kind of random. She looked up into the sky and said, "Dad, when's the earth going to stop?" And, I, of course, as a good father, took it as an opportunity to have an object lesson about one day this earth is going to be destroyed. I actually did. But I was thinking later, there is a time when the earth did stop. There's a time that the earth did stop, and it's a remarkable story. If you turn with me to Joshua, and there's a phrase here that spoke to my heart recently. It's in Joshua 10, if you're going to look here. Anytime we read a verse like this, it's good to ask why. Why did this happen? This amazing thing. And the earth stopped. It says in Joshua 10, verse 14, there was no day like this day before it or after it when the Lord listened to the voice of a man. The Lord fought for Israel. And what we see just above is that the sun stood still. And we know the sun doesn't travel over the earth. The earth travels around the sun. So actually, technically, the earth stopped. I don't understand the technicalities of it, but that's just an aside. But when my child asked me this question, when will the earth stop? I realized there is a time. Something spectacular happens, something which is unlike any other day before or after it. As long as this earth is in existence, the sun stopped, so to speak, or the earth stopped. And I was wondering, what was it that brought about this day? I don't know if you think about that. If you just kind of think in your mind about the book of Joshua. Joshua is one of the most unhindered, almost a parade of victory. It's a procession of victory. It's really exciting. In the Old Testament, it's hard to find a series of victories as complete, as comprehensive as what takes place in the book of Joshua. Which of those victories did this day, which it says here, there was no day like it before or after that the Lord listened to the voice of a man? And you kind of go, wow. If I think about those victories, they all kind of blur together in my mind. It's just in a few pages. There's 30 plus kings that the nation of Israel defeats. But the thing that struck me was it wasn't after their victories. There's only two times, at least as far as I can tell, in the book of Joshua that the Israelites failed. And this statement that there was no day like this before or after wasn't written after a victory. It was actually written after a failure, and a failure plus something else. And as I read this story, I realized that this is God's way, that all is not lost. We can have a failure. Joshua and the Israelites only failed a couple of times in what was otherwise an enormous string of successes. But the day that the Lord says there's no day like it before or after doesn't take place after one of the victories. It actually takes place after one of the few failures. And it spoke to me to understand why. But before we go into that, I just want to say there's a few instances of this principle in the Bible, and they're worth pointing out. I'd like to request you to turn to Psalms in chapter 73. We see here, as we've heard, one of the most exalted expressions of worship in the whole Bible. Psalm 73, verse 25. Whom have I in heaven but you? Besides you, I desire nothing on earth. And that's a tremendous expression of worship. Not for that to be theology, but for that to be our testimony, that I desire nothing but God on earth. And we can think about, just like in Joshua, it says, there's no day like it before or after. This is kind of a statement of worship. There's no statement of worship like it before or after. Well, what precedes this? If you look with me earlier in Psalm 73, how does Asaph start? Verse 2. As for me, my feet came close to stumbling. My steps almost slipped. I was envious of the arrogant. By the way, Asaph, your feet didn't come close to stumbling. That's disobeying the command to not covet, right? I was envious of the arrogant. He did sin. As for I saw the prosperity of the wicked. And if you go with me to verse 13, this is what he thought. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence. He's saying there's no profit in being godly. This is in the same psalm, by the way, that by the end of it, he's expressing one of the most exalted statements of worship in the Bible, which is to say, it's another example of there's a failure, a tremendous failure here in the beginning of this psalm, but it's not over. And that's what I want to encourage you, my brothers and sisters, with. That's how the Lord's been encouraging me recently, even in the midst of my failures. The story's not over. All is not lost. And Asaph goes on to say here that in verse 15, if I would have said what I was thinking, I would have betrayed a generation of God's people. But he didn't give up hope. It says in verse 17, he came into the sanctuary of God, and everything changed for him when he came into God's presence. And that is where our lives hinge too. When we fail, the question is, what next? Do I say, woe is me? Do I give up hope? Do I despair? Or will I say, I've got to come back into the presence of God? We see the same thing, if you want to look with me in the New Testament, in John chapter 21. Peter has one of the most tremendous failures ever when he denies Jesus 3 times. He denies that he even knew the Lord when the Lord is being examined in the court there. It's a tremendous failure. And yet, what we see in the book of Acts, you can read it later, but in Acts chapter 5, it says 3,000 hard-hearted, stubborn-necked Jews turned to faith in Jesus Christ. What happened for Peter between the time that he denied Jesus, he failed, and the time that he was used mightily by God? Jesus had said to him, I've prayed for you that your faith might not fail, and that after you have turned back, after you've come back to me, just like Asaph, I came into the sanctuary of God and I perceived their end. And he went from being envious of the wicked to having an incredible statement of devotion to the Lord. Similar for Peter, he went from denying he knew Jesus to being the means by which he was able to turn, the Lord was able to turn many hard hearts towards him. And if you look with me at John chapter 21 here, I love this. It says in verse 4, when the day was breaking, John 21 verse 4, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples didn't know it was him. And Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? And they said no. He said, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find a catch. So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved, who we know as John, said to Peter, it's the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he cowered in shame and fear because he had denied Jesus. It's not what it says. But that's his most recent experience in his mind. I failed the Lord. And yet, when he heard the Lord was calling, or he knew someone was calling, and when he realized it was the Lord who was calling, what does it say? He put on his outer garment and he threw himself into the sea. The other disciples took a while to get there, but Peter, the one who had failed most, couldn't wait to get back to Jesus. What did he know? All is not lost. And that's how the Lord's been encouraging me. And I just wanted to share that with you, that in the midst of a failure, the question isn't have you failed? The question is, what happens next? When the Lord calls you, will you respond? Or will you say, not me, Lord, you can't call me. If you only know what I've done, then you wouldn't be calling me. Or will you, like Peter, cast yourself into the sea, do whatever it takes, fully clothed. I got to get to him no matter what. But I can't let my failure overshadow the fact that Jesus Christ is calling me today. It says in Hebrews, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. And so the question is, if I have failed, do I hear him calling me? And if I hear him calling me, what do I do? And that for me is a real crisis. You may hear the phrase crisis of faith. It's a crisis of faith. What do I do when I hear the Lord calling? Do I say, you don't know who you're calling. Earlier, earlier in the Gospels, when Jesus said, when he had him cast his nets into the sea, and Peter saw it was Jesus, he fell down on his knees and said, "Lord, go away from me, I'm a sinful man." But here at the end, what happened? What was the effect of the 3 years that Peter had spent with Jesus? One of them was, he said, "Don't go away from me." At the beginning, he said, I don't have any right to be in your presence. At the end, I believe he still felt for sure he didn't have a right to be in his presence. But it's Jesus who's calling. Who am I to say no? Who am I to say to go away from me? And yet for myself, I will say many times when I have fallen or when I have sinned, I think, "Go away from me, Lord." And I refuse him. It says, see to it that you don't refuse him who is speaking. And today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. And it's that refusal. Am I willing to get up and run to Jesus? That's the question. Now, that being said, I want to turn back to Joshua because there's something interesting here that's instructive for us in the story of Joshua. The failure, if you're not familiar with it, the first failure was when one person stole some goods or took some goods from the defeated city of Ai there in Joshua chapter 6, 6, 7. But then the second mistake, the second sin of Israel was, if you look with me at Joshua chapter 9, it says that, verse 11, the Gibeonites said, "Our elders and the inhabitants of our country," they're acting like they live far away. They said, "Take provisions for your journey and go meet the Israelites and say, 'We're your servants,' and make a covenant with us." This is a lie. You probably know this, children, that the Gibeonites were lying to the Israelites. And they said in verse 13, "These wineskins which we filled were new, but now they're torn. And these clothes and sandals are worn out because of a long journey." In verse 14 it says, "The men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask the counsel of the Lord. And then Joshua made peace with them." And this was a grave error because they were commanded not to make peace with anyone in the promised land. And yet Joshua, without consulting the Lord, disobeyed God. And here's something that's amazing. It says, if you look with me at Joshua, so that's, whereas just like Asaph was envious of the wicked, just like Peter had denied the Lord, Joshua's here going, I made this mistake. He learns it, in verse 16 here. He learns that he's made a grave error. And then look at, this is kind of almost an amazing thing that happens in Joshua chapter 10. It says in verse 3, Joshua 10:3, "The king of Jerusalem sent word to the king of Hebron and the king of Jarmuth and the king of Lachish and the king of Eglon, saying, 'Come to me and help me. Let us attack Gibeon,'" these guys who just fooled Israel, "because Gibeon's made peace with Joshua and the sons of Israel." So 5 kings went up and they camped by Gibeon and fought against it. Then verse 6 says, "The men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua at the camp saying, 'Don't abandon your servants. Come and help us because all these kings have assembled against us.'" Now pause there for a second. If you're Joshua and you've just committed this grave error, what are you thinking? Wow, looks like the Lord's going to deliver me from my mistake. He's going to strike it from the record. These 5 kings, wow, what an amazing thing that these 5 kings assembled against the people that we shouldn't have made a covenant with. Let's just let them kill them. And then we'll be fine. And then it'll be as if we never sinned or we never failed to consult the Lord. That's kind of how I would think about it. Wow, we can strike it from the record. But that's not what Joshua does. Look at verse 7. It says that he went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Don't fear, I've given them into your hands." And what's amazing is in verse 11, it says, "As they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent, the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them, and they died. And more people died from the stones that God threw from heaven than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword." And then it's right after that it says, "There was no day like this before or after." What do we see there? God saw something in Joshua's response to his mistake. He didn't just want to try to cover it up and erase it. He wanted to make it right. He realized two wrongs don't make a right. And we can think, well, I sinned by making an agreement with these people. Let me just not help them. And then it's as if I never sinned. But you remember there's a psalm. I wrote it down. I can't remember it off the top of my head. Psalm 15 maybe, but it says, who may dwell on your holy hill? He whose walk is blameless. And then one thing he says is, who keeps his word even when it hurts. That's the one who can dwell in the presence of God. And what do we see Joshua doing? He's rallied all of the soldiers of Israel to basically go protect people who were supposed to be killed. And God saw that. And he said, you know what? You guys have swords. I'm going to throw rocks from heaven. And when Joshua said, we've got to finish these people off who've attacked the people that I wrongly made a covenant with, God was so happy, he stopped the earth from spinning. And to me, it's an amazing example of a heart that hates sin and loves righteousness. And Joshua hated the sin that he committed in making an agreement with Gibeon. But it would be unrighteous to allow the Gibeonites to die after they made an agreement with them. And so he fought for them. And it pleased the Lord so much that it says there's never been a day like it since. So that's really encouraged me to see, no matter what the failure may be, if I respond in righteousness, all is not lost. I'll close with a verse from Mark chapter 5, if you'll turn there, please. We can think that when we failed, especially after we've been a Christian for a while, if we fail, if we sin, we can think, the Lord may have wanted to do something great in my life, but he doesn't want to anymore. And I was blessed to see a picture of this in Mark chapter 5. If you look at verse 23, it says there's a synagogue official named Jairus, and he came and he fell at the Lord's feet and implored him earnestly, saying, Lord, my little daughter's at the point of death. Will you come and lay your hands on her? Time's running out. The window's about to close. If you can work a miracle, it's just she's so close to death. Would you come and work a miracle? And then what happens is we see there's an interruption. That a woman with a hemorrhage touches Jesus' cloak, and Jesus stops. He's on his way to do an amazing miracle. The time is running out as far as Jairus is concerned. And yet, Jesus stops. And then if you look with me at verse 33, while Jesus is still speaking to this woman, some of his friends come from his house and say, your daughter has died. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. And I was taking that as a picture in my life. I can think there's a time when, Lord, you better hurry and do a miracle. But then maybe through sin, through unbelief, through whatever, I can have this attitude of these people who say, don't trouble Jesus anymore. Time for the miracle's up. And it really encouraged me to see what Jesus said to Jairus here in verse 36. Jesus said, he overheard what was being spoken, and he said, don't be afraid any longer, only believe. And sometimes I've read that I thought only believe, or just a mustard seed size faith. There's a couple of different ways in which we use the word only in English. It's only an ant. What do you mean? It's not that big of a deal. It's only it was only the breeze, right? But then there's another way in which we use only, which is this sale is one day only. It's your only chance. And it's actually more important. What sense in which was Jesus saying only believe? Not a big deal to believe. No, I don't think so. I think he's saying, make belief the exclusive posture of your heart. You think your time is up, only believe. It says in Romans 4 that Abraham, in verse 19, as he considered his own body, that it was as good as dead, that he didn't waver in unbelief. In what? In the promise that he was going to have children. But it says he grew strong in faith and gave glory to God, being fully assured that the one who promised was able to do what he said. Doesn't matter if it looks like I'm almost dead. And I believe that's true spiritually for us too. Even if we've fallen, even if we've sinned, the question, will you believe all's not lost? Will you hear Jesus say, don't be afraid that I don't have a great plan for you. Don't be afraid that I won't fulfill my will in your life. Don't be afraid that you're dead to me now. Only believe. That which I have promised you, I'm willing to perform. If you'll hate sin, as Joshua did, as Asaph did, as Peter did, and if you'll love righteousness, all is not lost. I'll perform my word, even for you, a failure. It's encouraged me, and I hope it will encourage you too, to not lose heart in this race. Thank you.